Before the pillbox hats and Valentino gowns and White House tours, before becoming a Kennedy and long before becoming the wife of a Greek billionaire, there was a young career woman named Jacqueline Beauvoir. In the 1950s, before she became that Jackie, Jacqueline Beauvoir worked as the Inquiring Camera Girl for a Washington D.C. newspaper. She was courted by a handsome young congressman from Massachusetts, Jack Kennedy. Author Louis Bayard's new work of fiction, Jackie and Me, is narrated by a close friend of the Kennedy family, Lem Billings. Lem was a closeted gay man and Jack's close friend. The Kennedys enlisted him to screen Jackie as a potential wife for Jack.
He's the one who's tasked with befriending her and cultivating her and encouraging her to stay on, even when Jack is gone for long stretches of time. He's the one saying, no, this will work out.
Jackie and Me is a surprising portrait of a witty and opinionated young woman and a story of love, friendship, and betrayal. Bayard, great to have you here today to talk about your book, Jackie and Me.
Good to be here.
So this is an account of Jackie Kennedy when she was Jackie Beauvoir, before she married JFK. What made you interested in her in the years that the book takes place, which is like, I believe, 1951, 52?
Mm-hmm. I think because that's the Jackie we don't necessarily know. This is the Jackie before she became all those other Jackies, the wife, the first lady in the pillbox hat, and the widow with the beautiful children, the wife to the Greek tycoon, the paparazzi magnate, familiar to so many generations of tabloid readers, and I was one of them, I will admit that, or the professional book editor or the style icon. This is the Jackie before that. And she's this still uncertain, still liminal specimen who hasn't quite figured out who she is or what she's going to be doing or what her life is about. And there's something fascinating about that, this person we think we know trying to become that person. And what was she like before that, before she hardened into this public figure? And that was a really fun challenge to rediscover her because she's been lost to time.
She's so mythologized.
Right.
And the book opens with almost a poignant moment of Lem seeing her. She was, by that time, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, I believe.
She is that person that you can no longer touch or reach. She is inaccessible. She has created these barriers, both in her life where she lives, but also her persona is kind of a barricade against invasion. Of course, there were paparazzi photographers who were trying to break it, but she had learned by then to kind of keep that part of herself defended against scrutiny. And Lem is looking at her from the perspective of 1981. He's an old man now, or at least well into his 60s, and it reminds him of all the things that passed in their joint history, beginning in 1951 when they first met, and then carrying through to the present day. They've had a good run, interesting run together, but they're currently estranged, and the book tries to explain how that happened.
Lem Billings is the narrator. We see this book through his eyes. We see Jackie through his eyes. Tell us a little bit about him, because he's an actual person as well.
He is an actual person. I did not even know about him. He was Jack Kennedy's best friend. That was his own claim to fame, both in his own mind and in the world's mind. They first met in high school. They became fast friends. They were briefly college roommates, but they were best buds through life. Lem wasn't a political ally. He wasn't in the smoke-filled rooms. He wasn't holding offices. He helped in the campaigns, but he was not really political. He was just there to be a friend. And so when Jack needed a release from the pressures of his job, he would pick up the phone and call Lem. They would play backgammon, or they'd shoot the bull, or they would just chat. He was there to be that release valve for his friend. And he took great pride in that and took great pride in being intimate of the Kennedy family. That was his official relationship to the Kennedy clan, but there was also this private Lem that the book tries to explore, of a closeted gay man trying to find connections of his own in a society and a time that doesn't really allow for that.
And it's he was also very close to all of the Kennedy family.
Yes, he was. Yes.
A really close family friend, which was an interesting thing. This boisterous family, and can you tell us a little bit about that relationship he had with them, the extended family?
Yeah, he first met them all on school holiday. He and Jack were going to Choate. That was their private high school. They were going to boarding school. And he went home, and I think one of the first things that happened to him was he got scalded in the Kennedy family shower because somebody had switched the hot and the cold water valves. So he had to be carted to the hospital, but it helped endear him to the rest of the family. And he wound up going on so many of their vacations, whether it was Cape Cod or it was Palm Beach, he was there. In so many venues. And this continued through the end of his life. He was a regular visitor to the White House. He was there every weekend. He had his own room. The Secret Service waved him through. And if you look at photographs from the Kennedy administration, he's this Zelig-like presence, always in the background of pictures. He would just wander through these rose garden ceremonies and just be caught, snapped in the picture. They're just this smiling tall guy in the back row. So always there, but always careful not to intrude too much or to stake too large a claim on the public attention. He was there to be the pal and the jester. He was really the kind of Camelot's court jester.
Mm. What did it achieve for you as a writer to have this sort of triangle of JFK, Jackie, and Lem?
Well, I love triangles, and most writers would agree, I think. My last book, Courting Mr. Lincoln, was also based on a triangle involving Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd and Lincoln's best friend, Joshua Speed. What I love about triangles in fictional terms is their inherent instability. It's very hard for a triangle to resolve. Somebody's going to be getting less than they want, and somebody's going to be getting more. And that creates conflict, and conflict, of course, is the heart of all fiction in my mind.
Well, we also learned so much about Jackie through the eyes of Lem, that if she had been narrating, it might have been difficult to reveal all that. In some ways,
I think so. With Courting Mr. Lincoln, for instance, I couldn't figure out how to make Lincoln the narrator because I find him too mysterious to enter into. He was mysterious even to the people who knew him. I think Jackie has that quality too of mystery. I think that's why we're still so interested in her, because she didn't reveal her whole self at any time. You always feel there's something she's withholding from you. And that makes it harder to make her a narrator. You want to find somebody from the outside who can view her and can ask the same kind of questions that we as readers would ask. Oh, what's going on here? And I will just add that the Jackie that I'm talking about, this younger version of Jackie, is a more vulnerable, more approachable character who hasn't quite ossified into that public figure that we're now so familiar with.
Yeah, tell us a little more about that. She's almost being screened to be a spouse of JFK.
She's being groomed. I should add, first of all, that JFK, Jack, as he's called in the book, has no desire to get married. He is a very happy bachelor. He doesn't particularly want to tie the knot. He's in no hurry to walk down that aisle. And the one who's really pushing it, the one who's driving so much of the book is his father, Joe Kennedy. He's decided that if Jack is going to be president, which is very much on the horizon in Joe Kennedy's mind, that he needs to get married. If you look back at it, there's only been one president in American history who didn't have a wife, and that was James Buchanan. So even today, I think we're still a little freaked out by a political candidate who isn't married, right? What's going on there? So Joe Kennedy recognizes that a marriage needs to happen. But they need to find a suitable candidate. She needs to be Catholic, because of course the Kennedys are fiercely and famously Catholic. And she needs to be well-heeled, because the Kennedys are kind of that Arabiste, just up from the docks kind of Irish, even though they're wealthier than most people in America. So they have to find somebody who plugs the holes, who compensates for the perceived deficits. And it's very much a political decision. And it's very much a grooming process, as you said. They have to find somebody and then make it work. And Lem is enlisted to help make it work. He's the one who's tasked with befriending her and cultivating her and encouraging her to stay on, even when Jack is gone for long stretches of time. He's the one saying, this will work out.
Your book is fiction, but it reads almost as if it's nonfiction, but you're imagining conversations. How did you research this? How did you come up with knowing what people might have said in some of these scenarios?
It's a two-part process. One is the research. I spend at least 3 or 4 months up front just researching the basic lay of the land, just so I know what I'm doing. And then I start writing the book, and the book tells me what I still need to know, which is often considerable. And I never feel that I become a true expert on any of these people. I'm not a Kennedy expert. I'm not an expert on Lincoln or anything I've ever written about. But I learn enough to be able to conjure something. And then the story itself takes over, and they become, in effect, though they begin as real-life characters, they become, for my purposes, fictional characters, which means they have the liberty, they have the autonomy to do or say whatever they want to say or whatever I want them to say. So at that point, then I can then do what novelists always do, or fiction writers always do, which is forge an empathic bridge between me and them and figure out, okay, what is going on in their heads right now? What are they thinking? What would they be saying in these moments? And that, to me, is the glory of fiction, is being able to go there in a way that a more formal historian couldn't.
One conversation that's memorable, there are many, but Joe Kennedy in the closet with Jackie talking about some things, and that's a very remarkable conversation. How did you imagine that, just knowing what he was like as a powerful person? Or
that's the meeting they have in the doll room in the Kennedy compound. This is her first weekend visiting the Kennedy home, the Kennedy mansion, or whatever you want to call it. And yes, at one point, this is actually founded in fact. They were watching a movie, and they had, of course, a top-notch movie theater where they watched movies before they were even in theaters, because Joe Kennedy was involved in the film business. And at one point, apparently, Joe called Jackie out and called her into this neighborhood, this doll room. It's literally just filled with dolls that he'd collected as an ambassador to Britain. And he then proceeds to lay down the coordinates for the future that she's going to enjoy as Mrs. Kennedy. He tells her how much money is going to be coming to them. He tries to sell this deal. And the doll room, in my mind, is significant, or became significant when I learned about it, is because Jackie herself is being treated as a doll, as something that can be played with and pushed and carried around and told to do whatever she wants. So there's that conflict in the book between Jackie, her genuine feelings for Jack, because he was a very attractive, charismatic figure, but she has this yearning to be an independent woman. She's a career girl, as they used to say. She's a working journalist, working as an inquiring camera girl for the Washington Times-Herald. So there is a part of her that's kind of bending away toward matrimony, but also because she's a young woman of her time, that's what's expected of her. That's what her mother expects. That's what society expects. She's supposed to find a suitable husband. So that's the conflict that's playing out in this scene.
you had so many historical details that were so right on about the time, the 50s, and the cultural mores, and just the wardrobe and everything. It's almost as if you lived that.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Thank you. I use a lot of sources. Old magazines are quite wonderful. Jackie worked at Vogue magazine, for instance, for about a week. I found the issue that she worked on. And for me, the clothes are the most important part in some ways, because clothes tell us so much about gender roles, about mores, societal expectations. For instance, when Jackie went on the streets to do these man-on-the-street interviews, she'd be wearing stockings and heels, pearls, a linen skirt, and carrying at the same time this really heavy Gravlax camera. This perfect gentle lady, but doing this very kind of hard physical labor at the same time. And again, the contradictions of that between being a lady and being a working journalist were really interesting to me. So I find clothes fascinating. So I look at a lot of magazines and movies too from that time, and it's fun. I enjoy that part of it.
Yeah, I really did enjoy learning about her and seeing her as an individual, because that's not how we see her after all of the history and so much written about the Kennedys and everything that happened and her years in the public eye.
Yeah, she's this inescapably public figure, and also I think a kind of blank canvas on which we can project our own feelings about her. Whatever we think of her, she can be that person because she allows that. She's just, as I said, just recessive enough, just mysterious enough that we can put on her whatever she wants. So again, the fun part for me of writing this was finding the Jackie who wasn't that, who wasn't this engraven image, who was just this still inchoate figure trying to figure out what she wants from life, like we all do at some point at that age. She's just 21, 22 when this book is being written. She's a very young woman and still, naive in the ways of the world, at least in some ways. I just want to add that one of the seminal experiences for me while I was writing the book was watching the last season of The Crown. I don't know if you saw the last season, but of course it had the arc of Princess Diana and Prince Charles. And I was really struck by the parallels between these two stories. In both cases, Jackie and Diana, you have this rather ingenuous young woman, well-bred, blue-blooded, who's being tossed without a lot of preparation into a fairly brutal dynasty and left to fend for herself. So I found that really fascinating. Also interesting to me is they both became style icons, and it's almost as if their couture was a shield they used against the pressures they were feeling from within their own world.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say earlier that it almost felt like a royal marriage.
Yes, and it very much was a royal marriage. I mean, the Kennedys were considered the closest thing to American royalty. They were a famous family from the earliest years. So there was a lot of publicity about who would claim Jack. It was almost like a precursor to The Bachelor, right? Yeah. And she was the winner. She was the winner. They were on the cover of Life magazine before they were even married. So this was a big stakes gamble on everybody's part. I should add that the early years of their marriage were quite troubled, and Jackie, of course, had miscarriages, a stillbirth. And Jack, of course, continued his dalliances. So she wasn't quite prepared for what she was going to face.
And the family was a pretty tough group to come into and impress.
Yes, they were very tough. There was a certain amount of hazing that went on with the Kennedys. They were pretty rough and tumble with each other, and then when an outsider came into that, they didn't quite know what to do. There's the whole scene of Jackie's first weekend in Hyannisport involves a touch football game where she's brutalized by the sisters. She's mocked for overdressing for dinner. Yeah, it was a kind of cult, really, the Kennedy family, and you had to kind of work your way in and take some knocks. Get scalded in the shower, whatever it took to get you through the gate. And she certainly experienced that. And I don't know that she was ever entirely close to the Kennedy sisters.
Do you think Lem ever had any regrets about his role in kind of, courting her around, taking her around, kind of being the go-between between her and Joe and Jack?
Yeah, it's hard to say. He didn't profess a lot of regrets. Toward the very end, he was a Kennedy loyalist. In fact, he became a kind of second father to the second generation of Kennedys after Jack and Bobby were assassinated. He became a surrogate father to Bobby Jr., to Chris Lawford, to Tim Shriver. He was trying to make them the heirs of this legacy and make them suitable and appropriate and achieve their destiny. And in none of those cases did it quite work. But he was bound and determined to carry the Kennedy legacy forward. There is some evidence that toward the very end of his life, in his final weeks, that he started regretting that he'd spent so much of his life in service to this family. In that respect, I'm reminded of another book, The Reigns of the Day, where the butler, has dedicated his whole life to this one man, to this very distinguished family, and realizes too late, in effect, that they weren't worth it, So whether that happens to the Lem in the novel, I will let readers determine. But on paper, he was on board the whole time. He was all in.
I'm glad you said that about the reader determining that, because it's there's just sort of an undertone of that, but you have to kind of come to that conclusion yourself of loneliness, of the meaning of friendship, both between him and Jack and him and Jackie, that made the book just so much more rich, these sort of undertones that were there.
I'm glad to hear you say that. The reviewer in the New York Times, Elizabeth Egan, said that loneliness is on every page. And I really appreciate that she's saying that, because I looked at Lem as a product of his generation. So a closeted gay man who would have had to forge connections with men in random, anonymous ways, dangerous ways. The book considers at some length what happened to him after one encounter. That happened to a lot of gay men of that generation. So he would have found it virtually impossible to forge a personal relationship of his own. And so he subordinated all those feelings toward the Kennedys. But I'm sure there was a loneliness involved in that. Certainly the accounts of him toward the end of his life back that up.
Did he and Jackie communicate much in later years?
Not so much. The evidence suggests that they were estranged throughout the 70s. And of course, Lem, like the Kennedys, did not approve of the Onassis marriage. And also, by that time, Jackie was trying to distance herself from the Kennedy clan, from the Hyannisport axis, because that generation of kids, the ones I was just talking about, Joe Jr. and Bobby Jr., were all getting in lots of trouble. Jackie didn't want her kids exposed to that, so she pulled she pulled away from them pretty definitively and considered Lem part of that world too. So I think there was an estrangement, as best I can tell. She did show up to his funeral, which I found touching. As did and the Kennedy kids were the ones the pallbearers who carried the coffin around. So he was very much Kennedy to the end.
That is touching. I'm
Yeah.
glad to hear that,
Yeah.
happened, that they had that loyalty to him.
Yeah. Lem was there for a lot of what she and Jack went through, so I'm sure there was just a built-in intimacy just having experienced so much together.
Well, I'm glad you introduced us to Lem because I didn't know about him either.
You know, and I think that's almost by Lem's design. I don't think he wanted to be known. I talk about him being in the background of all those photographs. That was by design. He didn't want to be that character in the front. He didn't want anybody drawing the focus. He saw that as his purpose, his public service, really. He was offered things like the first directorship of the Peace Corps or an ambassadorship, and he turned them down because he just felt, no, his job is just to be Jack's pal.
So you write about historical figures a lot. Mm-hmm. Why the interest in that? Why do you want to give voice to people that we know and present them in a different way?
Because I feel like there's always something the historical record isn't telling us or can't tell us. And to me, that's the real thrill of this whole enterprise that I've undertaken, is finding the things we don't know and figuring out what they might be, and going into those closed rooms and trying to figure out what's going on. And again, to me, that's the gift, that's the privilege and prerogative of the novelist, is to make those leaps, to imagine your way into these places where nobody was present, nobody can say what happened. For instance, the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed, lots has been speculated about, whether it was sexual, whether it was romantic, but we don't know, and we'll never know. There are no photographers to catch what was going on. So to me, that's the proper role of the novelist, is to wander in. And there's so many stories that didn't get into the historical record. Many of them are people of color, many of them are women, queers, and so there are plenty of stories still to be told, I think.
Well, good for you. That's great. It's time to give voice to some of those.
Right?
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your writing process.
I write every day. I treat it like a job, as I think many professional writers do. I run into people who think of it as a muse-driven process where you just wait for inspiration to flow. It's like, no. You sit down. For me, it's a computer. It's a laptop in my lap, which is, I know, a strange way to do it these days. And I just start putting words on a page, which makes it sound easy, and it's not. There's nothing worse to write than that empty screen, but you just start putting stuff out there, and then that generates more stuff, and but it's a marathon, and I would say every book of mine takes about 2 years. That includes the research, which, as I said, is often considerable, but it's a daily, I won't call it a grind, but it's a daily progression. It's incremental, and you just have to be patient and trust that you'll get there. The one thing that I try to always know is my ending, because I need to know when I've gotten there. But I don't always know how I'm going to get there. I'm not one of those authors who plot everything in advance, like James Patterson, for instance, who doesn't even need to write the book because he's already kind of knows exactly what's going to happen at every stage. I have way stations. I know kind of where I need to get, but I don't know how to get there. And that, to me, is part of the fun. And sometimes the terror of writing the book is how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? And sometimes my best solutions come when I'm walking my dog, when I step away from everything. I think that's true of a lot of people. You stop consciously thinking of whatever you're grappling with, and then the universe sends you something, or hopefully. It doesn't always happen that way, but
I feel like your way is a lot more interesting, to let the book kind of reveal itself.
I agree. I mean, I wouldn't want to write a book if I knew everything was going to happen. To me, what's the point of that, if it were all storyboarded in my head? And that would mean you shut off all the discoveries that you make along the way. More than once I have felt the book talking back to me and disagreeing. It's like, no, this is not what's going to happen. Or a character will in effect say, no, I wouldn't say that, or I wouldn't do that. And I've learned to listen to them because they're smarter about their story than I am. I carry whatever ideas, preconceptions I have, but they're not always the right ones, and I try to listen to those moments. I'm making this sound more mystical than it is, but sometimes you do feel the story kind of correcting you. It's like, no, and wanting to be its organic self, which sometimes you're just not smart enough to know until it tells you.
You have a book that is being adapted to a Netflix film.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
It's called The Pale Blue Eye. It's a Gothic mystery thriller set in 1830 West Point, where a young Edgar Allan Poe is a cadet. A lot of people don't know that he was a cadet for 6 months at West Point. Speaking of things that are kind of lost in the historical record, we don't know a lot about his 6 months there, but I thought it would be entirely fitting to drop him into the middle of a mystery story, a Gothic mystery story, which is the genre he himself created with The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and have him fend for himself, as it were. That book came out about 15 years ago, but it was optioned by Scott Cooper, and it is filmed. It is now filmed. This cast includes Christian Bale, Robert Duvall, Gillian Anderson, and a really amazing group of actors. And it will be out on Netflix by the end of the year, so keep your subscriptions active. It's called The Pale Blue Eye. I'm looking forward to it.
And read the book.
Read the book,
first.
Of course. I thank you.
It's always
for
better
money.
to read the book
Always
first.
better read the book. Although there is a twist ending, so if you don't want to have it the reveal, you could stop maybe like 30 pages before the end and then catch the movie. But yes, that is the hope of any time a book is adapted, that the same tide lifts the book as well. But we'll see. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Did you get to be involved in that process at all, or how does that work?
I didn't have any contractual involvement beyond sort of lateraling my book and them running away with it. But I will say that the director-writer, Scott Cooper, was very generous about showing me drafts of the script and encouraging my input, which he didn't have to do. So I really appreciated that. In fact, it was a very stimulating process trying to figure out how to adapt a literary story to the film medium. It's challenging. A lot has to go away, right? It's not a limited run series. It's just a feature film. And you have to figure out, as an author, you have to kind of kill your darlings on a kind of massive scale and just decide, okay, what really needs to stay here? What can go away? And I found it very stimulating. In fact, it made me want to write a screenplay of my own someday in my spare time.
In your spare time, yes. Get to that soon.
Yes.
But you liked the script.
I did. I thought they did a terrific job, and I was there for a day and watched Christian Bale work with a young British actor named Harry Melling, who's playing Edgar Allan Poe, who's superb. And I just think it's going to be great. I'm crossing my fingers anyway, yeah.
So what are you going to work on next? Do you know?
That's a good question. I am working on something, but being a superstitious writer, I don't necessarily divulge. Can I talk about the project that's sitting in my drawer that I can't quite get off the ground? Because maybe someone will call in with inspiration or send a message. So I have an ancestor. Her name is Judith Varlet, direct ancestor, who was an accused witch in Hartford, Connecticut, 1662, 20 years before the Salem witch trial. And she was accused because the woman who was accusing all the people in town started speaking in a Dutch. Judith was Dutch, and this young woman started speaking in a Dutch accent. Not even actual Dutch, just Dutch accented English. And that was taken as proof that Judith had bewitched her, so she was thrown into jail, apparently convicted, and was only saved because she was a kinswoman of Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor of neighboring New Netherlands. So I thought, wow, I've got an accused witch in my family tree. I've got to work this. But I've had trouble getting it off the ground because I think Puritans are kind of tough. They're not fun. They're not fun people to hang around. So I need to find a way to kind of make it, enjoyable. So I've had a couple goes at it. I will not give it up, but that's the one that still has gotten away from me, but I'll get there. I will also say that the one thing I'm working on is not another president. I've done 3 presidents now. I don't think Millard Fillmore has any secrets left to offer, so I think we're just going to go travel back across the pond to England, where I'm also feel very at home.
Is there anybody in particular in mind, or do you not want to say? Don't want to say. Okay.
Cannot say.
Got
Veil
it.
of secrecy descending.
Don't want to jinx it. Don't want to jinx it. So, Louis Bayard, thank you so much for being with us today to talk with us about Jackie and me. I really enjoyed talking to you and loved your book.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Jackie and Me is available for purchase at Left Bank Books.
So this is how Lem describes the Jackie of this novel, the Jackie before she was Jackie. The scrapping career girl with the homemade clothes and the ladders in her stockings and the childlike sense of the ridiculous. The girl whose skin broke out every so often, who doubted herself at every turn, who wasn't even sure she wanted to marry at all, certainly not the kind of man she was supposed to marry. The Jackie nobody else knew but me, really, and the Jackie who can no longer be.